hopefully we'll talk about something that ultimately, to me, is how do we scale the human? And I'll explain what I mean by that. And at the end of the day, where I'm looking is designing sort of the human direct neural and computer interface as we move forward. So a little bit about myself, actually, some of the story. I began, my first purchase, I think, was maybe a bike, but the second purchase I ever made of my own was an Atari 800 XL computer. I was maybe in junior high or high school, and I would spend hours programming this thing in BASIC. I didn't have enough money to buy a floppy drive or anything else. I'd buy this thing, I'd program for hours, and then I'd click the switch off and everything would go away. It might explain also my intent here is why I didn't meet my wife till I was 30, but that's a whole nother story. But I was always fascinated by programming in the computer and how it worked. And of course, now we've gone from devices like this that I could buy to these large, massive computer systems. And ultimately today, I was fascinated on both sides, right? So the computational side, electrical engineering, but also what's the equivalence to the human brain? The more I learned about neuroscience and engineering, the more I became fascinated in the human brain. And ultimately, what's the relationship between the two? So let me just say to start this that, I think we have to first off understand, and inherently we do, but I want to explicitly make the fact that humans and technology are hopelessly intertwined. More than any other species, we're dependent on technology, even for survival, right? Many of us, except in a very temperate area, would probably not survive very long without simple tools like a roof over our head or something to help us get food, ultimately. And so our history, since we've picked up rocks and stones, is intertwined with technology. But we've used that technology. So our relationship with technology has always been in the sense of I use it. Even this picture with some of the more advanced cell phones and AI that's in there and everything else, we use that technology. I still use my hands. I still use my current body to interact with that phone in a different way. And what I think we're at the edge of, whether you look at AI, robotics, advanced robotics, or what I'm going to talk about now, which is neural reality, which I'll explain in a minute, we're really at a cusp. We're at a turning point of how we become intertwined and interact with technology. And that's the essence of what I'm going to talk about today. And so let's go back to the computer-human brain duality, because this gets a lot of attention now. AI is sort of the term that's hot nowadays. And actually, I would argue that that's an incorrect term. And it comes back around even from the 1940s, when Turing first talked about computer systems. And what the Turing definition really of a computer, now remember, a computer is a word that came in the English language in the 1600s. It actually meant people that do computations and work algorithms. The digital computer that Turing talked about was a machine that could do the computations for humans. But interestingly, at that same time, that's when Marvin Minsky and his team, or people around that area, that and this isn't a coined term, but that thinking was, machines that do computations like humans. And this is an important distinction. One word makes a very big difference of how you interpret what machines and humans and how we interact are. And so if you look at machines that do computations for humans, they become a tool that can augment us, that can help us do better at what we're doing, do computations better than humans, quite honestly. But when you start trying to get into the idea of machines that do computations like humans, that becomes a really complex question. And personally, and not the point of this talk directly, but I think that this is not a true duality. I think the term, in my view, and I'm happy to talk during the discussion or with anybody anytime otherwise, is I don't believe that machines do computations like humans, nor are they going to replace, nor do they have what I would call as artificial intelligence. They are not going to replace, in my view, the brain. And frankly, I don't know that they should or need to. I think, in fact, if we go to the computations for model and think about how humans and computers can interact in a much more effective way, we can look to a more efficient use of machines into the future. So my goal isn't so much to replace the human, which the like model does. And what we often talk about is, especially in the pop media or in science fiction, when computers, do away with the human because they become smarter than what we are. I actually think the question comes down to, or at least the way I look at it, is more like, how do I scale the human? And what limits the human being? I think we can put it in three general categories. I'm location limited. I am stuck, or I am limited, maybe not stuck, it's okay, but this sense of my existence, where I am, is stopped here at my skin. Essentially, this is the boundary I create for myself. I can't go much beyond that. And it's really because that's how I experience the world. My integration with the world, my sense of the world, my sense of self comes from my input system, which I'll talk more about in a second. And it's located in an area. So my network extends no further than my skin in the current way, right? And so there's my physical location. I'm also limited biologically by my capability. I have a motor system, and that is limited. It has a certain amount of force and torque that it can generate. As much as it is amazing for the size it is still limited. And then I'm resilience limited as well. You can put me in pretty much any environment, I'm not going to survive. And there's a lot of places I can build machines that are going to survive that biology will not. Space being one quick example. We have to build things to make the human survive in space. Deep water, chemical vats. I mean, there's a whole bunch of places that the biology can't survive. So those are the limitations. Then how do we scale the human around those? So what is the human good for? What do I actually want to scale? Or what it makes the human unique, I should say. It's good for lots of things. But the human, when I think about what sets the human unique, and we could talk about from the AI side, but for my argument here, our intellect, which is an abstract term, I get it, but things like creativity, the fact that everything that we just heard about storytelling and the importance of storytelling, that kind of goes into a lifelong experience. We look at the world in the context of what we've learned and what we know. And so our intelligence is not today, it's not situational, it's lifelong. And so lifelong experience is an important thing in human. Emotion and social connections, again, back to storytelling, but the importance of what we do as a human. And ultimately, we do well in unstructured problems. Computers and robotic systems work well when the algorithm can be defined, when the goal can be defined, or with the problems defined. But unstructured problems and environments, this human still easily does things that computer systems cannot. And that's similar to extrapolating beyond what that is. So how do I scale that? Well, the goal is I want to apply that to the technology that has these capabilities, right? So networking, robotics, computation, machine learning, which I use that term intentionally rather than artificial intelligence, machine learning, and what we can build from an engineering perspective. So how do I combine these two things? So first, let's start a little bit esoteric, is like, what is the human, right? On the very simplest terms, and this was also about 1949, the same time computational systems were coming out. Norbert Wiener, who was a mathematician at the time, basically laid out, and he wasn't the first, but kind of wrote in his book in the human use of human beings, this idea that really all we are is a message processor, right? And so we have this input system. It goes through this message processing system, our brain, which is incredibly complex, it's beautiful, goes to an output system, which essentially are our muscles, right? And so our system has input, a brain, and an output. And I'll just say here too, all of our knowledge, everything into the brain begins with the senses. And so as complex as the brain is, it still is programmed, it's still connected by our senses. And that's an important thing, right? The brain doesn't directly interact with the world. And so our limits are because of this input-output system, which is, as I talked about earlier, limits where we are in the ability to scale the human. So is there a way to get around that? Well, the first idea that we're all familiar with now, and also is of high importance or a lot of interest, is this idea of virtual or augmented reality. And so what we do is, rather than working with a local environment where the body is limited, we start to connect these systems that we are, collectively call virtual or augmented reality. And through them, we can connect to the output via hand sticks and joysticks and stuff, and then connect that information to the network, to virtual environments where a lot of that focus is, or even remote environments if we're talking about telepresence. The same thing, we can take data, or virtual or real data, computed data, whatever it happens to be, bring that back into a virtual reality system, which for the most part today are Oculus systems. They're beginning to get some early glove systems for haptic feedback, or Oculus, they're ocular, visual or auditory, and then we're starting to get some of these touch systems, these glove systems, and those are put back in on the input system. So they're much better that we can start to connect. We can in some ways start to expand our universe, but we're still limited by the input and output system that they're interacting with. So the glove, the audio, the visual can only do what those input systems can connect. In the same way, my output is limited by what sort of tools I can create. So what I'm proposing, or what we're working towards, is what I would say, the way I look at the world is something that we take us to one step further, and we call it neural reality. And the idea here is for, move beyond the input-output system that we have here and actually take the information on the wires. So if what used to come from the hands and the sensory is transmitted by a set of wires, nerves in the arm or all in the brain throughout the body, into that brain system. And so there's a couple things we all know about Neuralink, and a lot of people have been working on the idea of cortical processing for a long period of time. I'm working in the peripheral, and I'm not going to get into an argument about which is better or worse. I think both have their values. But I want to point out, while there's a lot of use of the term brain-machine interface, the brain is much more complicated than the interface we give it. And so I think it's important to understand when we think about where we interact with this message processing system, the brain. Cortical interfaces is a better term for what places like Elon Musk and the Neuralink company and others are doing, is they're cortical interfaces. The brain is far more complex. And so how do we interact with that entire messaging processing system? And I would intend, at least what we work with, is these neural reality systems that put information on the wire. So I'm not dependent on the hands any longer. I can bypass them, basically. And so if I directly interface with the wire, I can tap in and put any information I want on there from my remote or virtual world, send that to the brain, and the brain will process. The advantage in my mind of coming in from the peripheral is that is the way the system is normally meant to operate. And so everything that's involved in the brain, the emotional, the memory, all the other pre-conscious processing that happens, all comes from the peripheral and from the external senses. And similarly, all the processing that happens in the brain, not just my intent to move, but everything about controlling that movement comes through that wires back to the muscle system. So for me, I'm proposing that we tap in actually at the wires input and output as far away from that system as we can. There are advantages to cortical as well, and so I'm not ruling them out. I'm talking today about peripheral interfaces, but this is sort of all fits within this idea of neural reality. So we're no longer limited by the input and output systems. We can completely bypass them and effectively scale the individual. The other thing that's important is to know from a psychological perspective is when you have a glove on or you have something on, your brain knows it. So even though it becomes to feel very realistic, it still understands that it's connecting that information from its limited connection. By skipping that, we can actually recreate this idea where embodying that distance environment, embodying as though I exist somewhere else, becomes much different because now that information is inherent to you. And so the idea is that by bypassing input-output and going directly into that neural system, that becomes part of who you are and what the body is. And that has a profound impact on the way we interpret what we do. So that's the idea of neural reality. And back to this human technology paradigm shift. Of course, there's the kind of the idea, there's a lot of popular literature, not everybody buys into this, but there's this idea of intellect being replaced by technology, AI getting as smart as the human, robotics being more capable than the human, eventually deciding the human's not useful. I don't really buy that idea as much as I like the, I like the idea instead of this, of switching that to integrating, intellect is integrated into technology. Technology is integrated into the sense of self, so I can become the robotic system. The robotic system has all of its strength and its characteristics, but now I can put the intellect as the brain of this system. And I'll show you some examples of where this is coming to fruition. And we can certainly, we'll talk about where we think this can be used, but this really branches into all kinds of different directions. So this is the core idea, is that I want to actually make myself feel like I'm part of that robotic system. By integrating directly with the nervous system, I become connected to that robotic input system, whatever it happens to be, wherever it happens to be. And that has a profound shift in terms of how I experience that world. The word typically used is embodiment. I'm going to embody that robot. And in fact, if we put this over a network system, I can embody any robot by typing in a web address, or frankly, any technology by typing in its web address or connecting to the network. And that's the really significant goal we're working on. So let me start with just going back to where a lot of this has begun. Some of our first system is people have limb loss. So just a short story. I started out being the engineer, and I thought, you know what? People are going to want to have their hand that feels like their hand, or not feels like, but looks like their hand, does tasks, it becomes what it can do. Everybody I've talked to go back to the last speaker, in the last session, everybody, not a single person has talked about the technical aspects of their hand. Every single one of them, when I ask them what they want, the first thing they say is, I want to hold my wife's hand. Now bear in mind, these are people that may, in all of our subjects, have only lost one limb, but they still have their other, and they live with their significant other. So the fact that they still want to touch hands is not a matter that they can't, because they have a hand, they can still do that. But this loss of their arm is significant, and it's the most important thing that they're missing. And so we've been building systems that can connect to the hand and control it, so they think about moving their hand. Because we're recording that information on the output, we can actually convert it into prosthetic movement and give the hand the motion as though they were thinking about it. But the other thing, thinking about the touch side, is what we do now is we take data, we take information of pressure sensors from the fingertips of the prosthesis. It's digital data. It's run through a bunch of wires, and then we convert that to neural data on our neural interface, pass that back in directly to the peripheral nerve. And what the person will say, this individual in particular, first time he was in the lab, we turned on this system, and he stopped for a second. He said, that's my thumb. I haven't felt my thumb since I lost my arm. And so by stimulating directly, it was his thumb, not a representation of his thumb, not something else, his thumb. And he had a phantom, so he had a phantom sensation, but for the first time he felt his thumb since the injury. And so if we go further, what the common quote from all of them, and you'll hear this in this little testimony here in a second, is that without the sensation, that prosthesis is just a tool. Even though it's attached to his arm, this is still a tool at the end of that residual limb. But as soon as we turn on sensation, they'll say it's my hand. And in fact, they start talking very differently. And you'll hear it in this video here in a second too, but they start saying, I'm picking things up. Not with the prosthesis, my hand, I'm picking it up. And so they've embodied this. This hand becomes part of their self, okay? And so this individual, it's a little short video clip. What we've been able to show from this connection is that we can mimic the characteristics of what you normally feel in the hand. We can control that hand as though it's yours. So the input output, we've shown we can do that. And we have an emotional connection. So I'm gonna let this gentleman talk about his story on his own. He was talking about, just to set up, he's talking about his wife for the first time when he turns on sensation. And he is missing a limb. And so when he says my hand, interestingly, he's actually talking about the prosthetic. So let me play this real quick for you.
She comes to the door, so she reaches out and she grabs my hand. And we hugged. I grabbed her arm and I petted it just so I could feel her skin. I was whole. I was complete. This is a tool. When the system's turned on, it's mine. It's my hand. What this system done personally for me, it takes the touch and turns it to an emotional feeling, a physical touch to an emotional feeling.
And so that's the idea. And just from a business perspective, that system is now, there's been 20 million invested in this from non-dilutive sources so far. We have basically a preclinical system to make this go in this first example of the neural reality system. This is about a 1 to 2 billion global market for upper limb amputees, for better prosthetic function, social connection, pain reduction, which comes along when we start stimulating the peripheral from phantom pain, and basically improved quality of life. We've published on all this and have seen that work. And right now we have a FDA trial for the early feasibility randomized clinical trial. So this is the first example, the closest to market of a neural reality system like what we've been talking about. But let's go back to the relationship with the human. So this is what I just showed you where he has his prosthesis attached. But the interesting point is this is all data. And so if I take that arm or a hand or actually any other robotic system, put it anywhere in the world, I can still collect that sensor data, send it back and connect it to the individual. And this is still their hand. It'll feel exactly the same. So now I can scale location. That hand, not a representation, but his hand will be somewhere else. And so this gets us to that scaling of location. And it's in fact, because I can put it in any robotic system, I can scale its capability, and I can put it any system anywhere, it kind of handles the resilience. So for the three things I defined up front, by connecting to the neural system, we in fact can scale these three elements that have limited the human before by putting the elect into the robot, driving that system. I can drive prosthetic systems that are anthropomorphic, or I can drive robotic systems, or you imagine what it can be, but it can still be my hand. It can still be my presence in what I'm doing. So in this way, I can be anywhere, anytime. I'm only limited by the engineering that I can dream up to connect through the human, and I'm resilient depending where the technology that we have is being put. And so just to talk briefly about the neural reality component and how we're getting there, we have three kind of versions of interfaces that are being worked on. I've talked about Cortical, and other people at CASE are working on this. So we're looking for other partners to do different directions in the same concepts. The implanted system directly connected to the peripheral nerve itself for amputee limb loss individuals makes sense. This is the highest fidelity because we have close interaction with the nerves, but probably the longest to get any general acceptance. We also have a system that's wearable. And so it's not like haptic gloves that touch the fingertip. We're actually doing a neural approach to this. So it's still integrated with the nerve. This is very close to the virtual reality though. So it's the lowest fidelity, but the quickest acceptance to move through as we look at how we get further along. And then we're working on minimally invasive ways that, like a shot, can get to the same interface as the implanted version, but basically be nothing more than a shot like you would get inoculated. And this will have the same highest fidelity. And there's a moderate path to acceptance, but we're in early development of that. So that's where we sit in the neural interface, which is a critical part of all this. We've been developing a neural reality platform. So one of the things is to connect anywhere in the world with any device, we have to have a sort of an open architecture system. So we're developing and have implemented a neural reality platform that has a open, or not open, but usable API system that any device, whether it's a cortical interface or an implant like we're doing, or any haptic device, translates to a universal language that can connect to any device on the outside. And so building a platform that now the human becomes an edge device with a common language to connect to any technology that's also writing to the same language. We've developed this system. We've implemented cases where we're starting here at Case Western Reserve University here in Cleveland. We have a node at LA where we've actually been driving robotic systems. I think for time I won't show you the video for this, but I'm happy to if we want. Where a student now with a surface system in Cleveland is directly driving a robotic system and feeling what the robot's touching in Los Angeles, and in fact was peeling a banana with a colleague in Los Angeles through that connection. We have a couple different places. The dark lines are places where we've actually put the API and been connecting, and others that we're talking with for doing this. So we're starting, this kind of looks like to me like the early days of ARPA-E and the internet. So it's interesting how starting to expand out this platform for neural reality. I'm going to skip that. The last couple of things here really to talk about then is that one of the things about the Institute is not just developing the technology and how we build it. One of the things I think is important as we move forward in technology and the interaction with humans is, we can't just build it and let it go out there. We have to figure out ethically how do we do it. So let's build ethics, build in the right model from the beginning, as opposed to getting a very large system later that becomes very difficult to fix. So we're building the whole institute around not just the engineers, but the and neuroscientists in med school for doing this, but also then the ethicists and the folks that think about what should we be doing, and then the regulatory, the legal of how we do it legally, and then the entrepreneurial side. Where is the best, most effective place to move this technology out? How does it affect society? And then this loop. And so one can imagine lots of different uses for this that we're happy to talk about that have different implications, but we want to get those out in changing society. And one of them, I'll just say, the simple one is, imagine now, rather than sending emojis, you can send a feelogy or something of that nature where, I don't just have to show you a handshake, you can feel me shake your hand type of ideas. And so we're looking at 3 different application domains. We build this out, and I'm almost through here. Healthcare is the big one. We've talked about prosthetics, pain management goes with it, rehab, psychology. There's things that the embodiment can do, and I'm happy to talk about those. But we're also looking at the time of COVID. COVID has inspired this idea of the healthcare avatar. Right now, telemedicine has had a huge bump because of COVID. But it's basically looking at somebody via video. And if you talk to any clinician, what's really important is the laying of hands, the feeling, the touching. And so now we can imagine where the technology, the sensory technology on the physician over the network can interact with any system, robotic or other sensors, at the patient directly. Now the expertise of the physician can directly interact with the subject well beyond what's possible with telemedicine. And so moving to the next domain for that. In fact, even here, you can imagine a loved one, as opposed now, if you're in COVID, you can't hold the hands of your loved one as they're passing away. We could do the same thing, even a family connection robot, to get a new level of connection. Industry 5.0 is about putting humans, at least it's ways out. We're talking about humans in the loop. There's different applications in that, including in the military, underwater, explosive ordnance disposal, underwater operations. Thinking in space, where if I can act in space without being in space, we can now put expertise in space that doesn't require all the payload and biological, management around that. Edutainment. Don't even need probably to talk about a whole lot of that. There's a lot of opportunities where a lot of it's being done now. But I do want to think about even ideas like new media. If touch becomes something that we're connected to on a network and it's with you inherently. So one of the difference between the VR systems and what we're doing is if it's connected to your nerves, it's directly with you. As you walk around the society, you're not encumbered by all the technological stuff that's available now for the VR systems. It's just part of you. Our system connects by Bluetooth right now. The prosthetic one connects the Bluetooth to a phone that can connect to the internet. Now you can imagine walking around in a museum and feeling what the artist felt when they made it, or whatever you want to do. And so there's a whole bunch of new ideas of what we can do. So the idea around human fusions is basically the idea of, Neural interfaces, this reality platform, mechatronic integration, building systems that integrate with the human directly, the transdisciplinarity, and pushing out translation into different directions. So touch is our first and is the most prominent now, but the idea of the neural interface can extend to all the other senses as well. So that's where we're making an impact today, but we can go beyond that. And ultimately our vision is that we're transforming that human technology relationship for ultimately a thriving, just, and connected society where we're looking at the next integration where humans and technology are integrated in much more intimate fashion to bring us all closer together in what we're doing and scale the human capabilities. So with that, I'll stop and question times if we have any here, if we have time. There's the contact information if you want. I'm happy to talk a little bit beyond that. And Matt, thank you so much for your time.
Goodness. Dustin, that's great. Why don't you go ahead and just bring yourself back to main screen for some Q&A, as you can always pop it up if we do get. So this is the rare thing. You have either stunned, dumbfounded our audience. I don't think people think there's so much that you put out. I think people are still even grasping what would I ask from it. And then many times over the course of this, I had the point where I went right into, we're just talking about the Food Network. What about smell? Right. And
yeah, great question. And so this is actually one of the things, smell as a input. Disney did a lot of this stuff, as we all know, right? Back in the early days of the theaters they built and trying to build smell. Smell is probably more complex than touch to be able to do. And to actually create physical environment in the virtual reality where you're using the olfactory system is hard, right? You carry chemical vats, you got to mix them, all this kind of stuff. So one of the interesting things to me is that the olfactory nerves are available, right? Now, we're a ways from getting that sort of connection, but the still idea of the neural reality. Again, everything that's connected, the senses that experience the world, has behind them a communication system. If we can continue to evolve that connection, tap into that, we can supplant, whether it's taste, smell, balance, which is a big thing with virtual reality systems. All of those have a neural connection to that central processor. So the very long-term vision is that all of those become available. And that's why, to me, the thought of Kant is actually really important, right? Because it gets to, in some ways, to go just a little beyond, it's like, if you control the input, if you control the senses, you control reality, right? Essentially, reality is what the senses bring in. And that's a real interesting concept, particularly from the baseline level of like, what is reality, where my body exists today, et cetera. So I think these are incredibly difficult things to do. I think smell is probably one of the hardest senses to get. Taste, because of the locations where nerves and things are a bit difficult to get to, is probably an easier sense to duplicate. People are working on these, by the way. So, yeah. If somebody on the audience is working, I would love to have them engage with us, by the way. So that's our thoughts there.
I think we're more a business than a technical audience on this side, although maybe someone on here, the company they're working for may have engineers, et cetera, working in these areas. So obviously, questions came up about, right, the ethics, I think, is also what's hitting everyone, right? We're worried about our car being hacked. Yeah. And now we're getting into that sensibility of our senses being hacked. So maybe talk a little bit about, Dustin, about your imagination, your dreams of how you create the privacy and the networks that protect that.
Yeah, so this is actually one of the most critical things. When I talked about that circle, from the beginning, we have to build in, nothing is ever perfect, but this is sort of the next version. Our data is being hacked now. The question is, how are you going to hack you, right? And if you think about this sense that, if my sense of touch is out there, we think about the one-to-one, like the prosthetic, that's easy to sort of think about, but you can throw that away, right? It's data now. I could connect 5 people together to the same sensation, or somebody could put artificial sensation on that stream in a good or bad way. And so I think there's a couple different ways that we have to look at that. First off, the essence of the question is absolutely critical. From the beginning, we have to build security in there. And rather than, this balance of the open internet. So when the internet began, it was all about being open. And so the idea of security and individuality, in fact, the net lives from business folks. I don't want to overstep my bounds, but one of the problems is that we basically commoditize data, and that's what runs on the data. So it's actually counterproductive to secure that data. I think what one of the critical things is, and that's what everybody struggles with, right? I'm shocked. I go VPN, so I'm on Europe most of the time. When they pop up everybody that's a cookie on my site, it horrifies me. So, I mean, at the beginning, we have to find some other monetization, but the idea of collecting my data is problematic. And if we can secure that down from the beginning, then I think we can get there. So, I understand, and I'm curious from the business perspective how people look at that. But to me, I think we have to build security from the one beginning and understand the individual needs to control that, or we'll have problems with this down the road too.
Yeah, and I think obviously, my guess is that from the business perspective or technologically IT perspective on it, it would get into things like blockchain, computational related elements. Obviously, we've got quantum computing coming up, which is going to make it even all more complex with all of that. But yes, I see that sort of we had an earlier talk around AI and the privacy around data and all those kind of things. And that merged with kind of blockchain, distributed ledger, the computational math, protecting the access to this is hopefully, yes, the path forward with this. I think there's a great, because we just have a couple of minutes left before we go on our lunch break. Although I personally could talk with you for another half an hour or more easily. Great question from Diane Faulkner here, which gets at, are there entirely new senses that we may discover in the way that I know there's like anesthesia. I'm getting the word wrong because it's coming to me, but from deep in my head, where people smell lightning, etc. Do you see the potential for actually that kind of human enhancement out of some of literally the technology that you're building? And
yeah, so you actually bring up two issues the way you said that. Smelling lightning is like Sachs wrote a book, the woman who mistook me for a hat, or whatever the exact title was. I apologize, but the sensory synesthesia, where you sense one and something else. And so that's a wiring issue in the way the person is set up. And they're great. They're super interesting cases. But I think what's more relevant for the conversation here is, how does the brain process the information to start with? We think of the senses because all of our life we've lived with touch. And so when we started all this work, actually about 10 years ago, we thought, oh, I need to duplicate touch. The reality is the brain is plastic, right? I mean, touch doesn't mean anything when you're a newborn. The reason kids are always exploring space, touching their lips and using their hands, is the hands and the lips are the largest part of your sensory input. And so they're learning. And really what the brain is, this goes back to that message processor thing. We are a sensory aggregator, right? We're making a picture of the world. So our vision is tied to what we feel, which is tied to what we hear. And so if you could think about our whole history, ultimately, is what we put together by the senses. And in fact, they're all certainly interrelated. If we think about things like the smell of grandma's cookies, right? If you tie that back memory-wise, if you have a grandma that was loving and the cookies tasted good and you had a wonderful environment, they bring up all kinds of positive memories. The exact same smell could bring up bad memories in other situations where maybe grandma always smelled bad, or whatever it is, a kid that made it weird, right? So I don't want to go into all that. But so actually what a smell is not fixed. Right. And so we can think about the same thing now, because I can directly tap into the nerve. It's not so much about, do I duplicate what the hand had, but how much information can I put in that the brain can process? And as long as I can put in unique patterns, unique information, the brain can learn that. And so in that way, what I think is that we can go beyond just giving touch, but you could potentially see or feel blue, right? Because if I put a unique pattern for blue, then that becomes associated with blue, and you can actually feel what blue is. So I think there's actually a huge opportunity here to go well beyond replacing touch, but thinking about what's the limit of that human creativity, which again, that's another level of scaling that, because we're just starting to get into that research, is a little early to say. But I think this is one of the most fascinating areas, is can we scale the capabilities beyond just the physical, but actually our sensory and our other senses, like you're talking about with this. So super interesting. Last thing I'll finish with, Matt, because I know we're probably done. I don't want to have more questions, but I did speak a lot about from the technical and where we're going, which is fairly early. But I do want to, for people that are interested, I think that the prosthetics, for example, is translating now. We're looking at the neural reality platform. Setting up that infrastructure is probably one of the early things to get out there as people start to get their own creativity. We're creating an app store for human sense. And so that's one area that I think would be of interest to where people in their mindset of where it's going. And then also like VR, think about commercial side where, this whole new reality is hard, but you can use VR for manuals in the right space. I think touch is the same way. So imagine if you're a service person someplace and you need to feel how hard somebody's torquing on it, or you need to help them do something. So I think that while I presented a grand scheme, I want to just lay out there before I leave that there's a lot of today things that aren't as grand, but but certainly possible that I'd like to, I think that the business side is one of the pieces we'd like to engage with HFI to look at what moves out now can be useful as we're creating the 10-year, 20-year vision for the other stuff.